My name is Faith Mercer. I am 47 years old. On the morning of the memorial ceremony in Caldwell, Georgia, my older sister Diane stood 8 feet away from me in the fellowship hall of First Community Church and told the woman next to her that I had never really served, not in the way that counted. She said it in a voice that was not quite quiet enough, and the woman next to her nodded the way people nod when they are agreeing with something they cannot personally verify but are willing to accept on authority. And I stood with my hands at my sides and I looked at the photograph of Raymond Toth on the stand near the podium and I did not say a word. What happened in the next 14 minutes changed the shape of every relationship in my family in ways I am still learning to name. I did not know. When I had driven to that ceremony in my old green pickup with the cracked passenger side mirror and the heating pad wedged behind my lumbar, that 23 people had made longer trips than mine, specifically to be in that room. I did not know that Sergeant Major Isaiah Tran had woken at 4 a.m. in Portland, Oregon, and driven to the airport with a manila folder he had been adding to for 6 years. I did not know that the last man to walk through the back door of that fellowship hall had driven 11 hours from outside Knoxville, Tennessee, and had heard about the ceremony not from me, but from someone who had heard it, from Isaiah Tran, who had been making phone calls every evening for 3 weeks. And I did not know that the youngest man in that group, the one who had been 19 years old on the night I walked 200 meters across open ground to find him, was going to look at my sister with those quiet eyes of his and say 4 words that contained more weight than 4 words should be able to carry. I am going to tell you what happened in that room. But to understand what it meant, you need to know what came before it. And what came before it is a long story. And most of it I have never told anyone, not even Polly. And Polly knows everything. My father was Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer, United States Army, 28 years of active service. He did 2 tours in Vietnam in the late 1960s and 1 in Desert Storm in 1991. He was 61 years old during Desert Storm, which tells you something about the kind of man he was. The kind who does not stop simply because the calendar suggests he should have. He was not a cruel man. He was not particularly a tender man either. He was a man who expressed love in the vocabulary of reliability. He showed up, he was on time, he did what he said he would do, and he expected the same from the people he had raised. He had high standards and he held them quietly, and the absence of criticism from him was the highest form of approval he had available to offer. I understood this by the time I was 12 years old. Understanding it did not make it easier, exactly, but it gave me a framework for interpreting him, and that framework was useful across the next 35 years. He had 2 daughters. My sister Diane was 4 years older than me. Diane had always been what my father called organized, which was his word for someone who knew what they wanted and moved efficiently toward it. She had studied business at the University of Georgia, graduated in 3.5 years, taken a position at a marketing firm in Atlanta, and by the time she was 26, she had met Robert, who was in his 2nd year of law school, and by the time she was 28, she had a daughter, and by the time she was 31, she had 2 more children and a house in the suburbs of Atlanta with a kitchen that she renovated twice and a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like what a life in our family was supposed to look like. She was organized. She had earned her place in the particular vocabulary my father had available. I was not organized in that sense. I was the daughter who sat in the back of the church growing up and asked the minister questions after the service that he was not entirely prepared to answer. I was the daughter who read too slowly and felt things too intensely, and who found, somewhere around the age of 15, that the place I was most able to be myself was a conversation, any conversation, with someone who needed to say something true. I was not good at distance from other people's pain. I was not built for the clean separation that lets a person observe suffering from a safe position and do their job well without being changed by it. I was built to go in. I had not known that was a professional skill until much later. When I was 15, it was just the thing that made me strange at family gatherings and exceptionally useful to whoever was having the worst night of their life. I was 22 years old when I enrolled in seminary. I had spent 2 years after high school doing things I cannot entirely account for. 1 semester at the University of Georgia, 1 year working at a veterinary clinic in Decatur, 6 months helping to run a community center in a neighborhood that needed one. I was not lost during those years. I was circling something, the way a person circles a place they need to land before they know they need to land there. Seminary was not a sudden decision. It was more like the end of a very long process of elimination. By the time I walked into the admissions office of Columbia Theological Seminary, I had ruled out most other answers, and this was what remained. My father sat at the kitchen table the night I told him. He folded his hands together in front of him the way he did when he was choosing his words carefully, which always meant he was choosing against the first set of words that had arrived, because the first set was usually something he had decided was not helpful to say. He was quiet for 12 seconds, which I counted because I had developed the habit of counting time in emotionally charged situations years before I understood why. He said, "A chaplain is not nothing." I looked at him. He looked at the table. He said it again, as if repetition would add the quality of reassurance it lacked the first time. "A chaplain is not nothing." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "You could have been a nurse." I said, "I know." He said, "The military needs nurses as much as it needs anything." I said, "I'm not a nurse." He said, "No." He unfolded his hands. He said, "Well," and that was all he had. He stood up and refilled his coffee and went into the living room, and I sat at the table for a while before I followed him. I want to be honest about what that conversation cost me. Not in the way of obvious damage. My father was not a man who delivered wounds intentionally. But there is a specific category of dismissal that lands in a person and takes root, not because it is malicious, but because it comes from someone whose opinion you have organized your sense of self around for your entire conscious life. And my father's opinion of what I had chosen was that it was not nothing, which is a different thing from saying it was something. And that difference lived in me for a long time. I graduated from seminary 23 months later and received my commission as a first lieutenant and entered the Army as a chaplain. I was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia for my first 2 years, which had the particular convenience of being close enough to my family that I could appear at gatherings without a logistical production, and far enough that I did not have to explain my daily life in any detail. My daily life at that point was not dramatic. It was 314 soldiers in my care, and a calendar that had no blank days, and a small office in a building that smelled of industrial cleaning products and the particular mustiness of institutional carpets. And it was conversations, one after another, with people who were trying to hold their lives together under the specific pressures that a military life applies. Marriages, distance, the gap between the person who deployed and the person who came home, and the relationship between those two people and the spouse who had been waiting and had become someone different while waiting. Substance use, grief, the slow erosion of a sense of self that happens when you are told repeatedly that the correct self is a uniform. I sat with all of it. I was good at it in the way that a person is good at the thing they were made for, which is to say I did not experience it as effort even when it was difficult. I deployed to Afghanistan in 2006. I was 31 years old. My back had been showing the first signs of the injury that would follow me for the next 19 years. A deep muscular impingement in my lower left lumbar. The kind of compression that an orthopedic surgeon at Fort Benning described to me as the sort of thing that accumulates over time and does not announce itself all at once, but rather builds in the body like sediment. I wore a back brace on cold mornings. I kept ibuprofen in the small left cargo pocket of my uniform, alongside a folded photograph of my dog, a shepherd mix named Corporal, who was staying with Polly for the duration of the deployment and who was, according to Polly's reports, eating better than either of us. I was not supposed to lift anything over 40 pounds, a restriction I followed with the kind of creative compliance that the Army generates in people who are determined to do their jobs fully. I want to tell you about what the work looked like in the field, because the field version is different from the base version in ways that matter. On base, The work is mostly about time. Time in the office, time in the chapel, time in the hallways after services, when people linger because they need something they have not yet found language for. In the field, time does not operate on a schedule that a chaplain can plan around. In the field, the work arrives at whatever hour it decides to arrive, and the people who need it are not always in a position to come to you. And so you go to them. And the going can take you further into difficult territory than a job description might suggest. My battalion commander during that first deployment was Lieutenant Colonel Gregory Hayward. He told me during our first briefing that my job was to be available. He said it in the particular tone that people use when they want a word to mean everything and nothing at the same time. The tone of someone issuing a directive that has no specific content and therefore cannot be violated and therefore covers everything that happens after it. I said, yes, sir. I meant it when I said it. I simply did not know yet what available was going to require. The forward operating base we were attached to was a collection of structures in Kunar province that I am not going to describe in detail because the details still belong to the people who lived and worked and died there and who are not available for consultation about what to share. What I will tell you is that the perimeter was not a clean line between safety and danger. Nothing in Kunar province in 2006 was a clean line. The line moved. It moved daily, sometimes hourly. The soldiers understood this and had adapted to it. The adaptation looked, from the outside, like a kind of hardness, a surface quality that kept the uncertainty from being visible. Underneath the surface was something different, and that something different was what I was there to address. I want to tell you about Corporal James Weathers. He was 22 years old and he was from a small town in Alabama, and he had been in country for 4 months when I first met him. He had already lost 2 friends in an ambush on a patrol road 3 kilometers from the base, and he had been present for both deaths, and he was carrying both of them in a way that he could not describe, but that was visible in the way he held his body. The constant slight bracing, as if impact were always arriving and needed to be absorbed before it landed. He did not come to me for religious reasons. He came because someone had told him that the chaplain's office was the one place in the building where a soldier could say, I do not think I can do this without it going into a report. That was true. The confidentiality a chaplain carries is not the same as a therapist's confidentiality. It is older and in some ways more absolute. I sat with James Weathers for 3 hours the first time, and he did not pray, and I did not require him to. He talked about his mother's kitchen. He talked about the sound of the explosions and how they had nested in his chest and he could not get them out. He talked about a dog he had left with his neighbor back home. He came back twice a week for the remaining 7 months of the deployment. He went home. 4 months after I returned stateside, I received a letter from him. He was enrolled in community college. He was studying nursing. He said the conversation we had one Tuesday in October about the difference between surviving and continuing had kept him from quitting 3 separate times. I put that letter in a drawer. I have kept it for 16 years. I will keep it until I am done keeping things. But James Weathers is one story, and behind him are more than 140 more that I am not going to tell in their full form, because this is not an inventory of what I did. What I want to give you is the texture, the feel of work that is not done at a distance, the feel of being in the place where the pain is, consistently, across months, across multiple deployments, across 22 years of service, and never once announcing that this was what you were doing, because announcing it would have changed what it was. My first deployment ended in July of 2007. I came home to Fort Benning with a back that was worse than it had been when I left, and a specific internal quiet that I recognized from my father, the quiet of someone who has been somewhere and done something and has no particular interest in itemizing it for the people who were not there. I went to a family gathering in August. It was a cookout at my Aunt Marjorie's house in Decatur, the kind of event that the Mercer family had been producing for decades, with folding tables in the backyard and a cooler of drinks. and the particular social choreography of military families comparing service records in the space between the potato salad and the hamburgers. I stood at the periphery of those conversations the way I always had. Someone asked how it was over there. I said, fine. They said, but you were safe, right? I said, reasonably. They said, you're the chaplain, so they keep you away from the real stuff, right? I smiled. I said something like that, and the conversation moved on, and I refilled my sweet tea. My second deployment was to Iraq in 2008 through 2009. Different terrain, different unit, same work. The proportions shifted somewhat. More trauma response in the immediate aftermath of incidents, more grief, more of what I privately called the translation work, which is helping a person find the language for something that language was not designed to contain. I was good at waiting. I had been good at it since childhood, since learning that the most important thing a person can say will not arrive as long as you are pushing toward it, that you have to let the silence sit until the person decides the silence is safer than the keeping. I had perfected this over years. I sat with people and let the silence sit, and they filled it. And what came out of the filling was almost always the real thing, the underneath thing, the thing that mattered. My lower back sustained its most significant injury during my third deployment, which was back to Afghanistan in 2009 through 2010. The injury did not come from a clinical procedure or a sports accident or the kind of thing that generates a clean diagnosis with a clear origin story. It came from being knocked off the side of a vehicle by a blast, falling approximately 12 feet, and landing on my left side on ground that did not give. The specifics of what I was doing on that vehicle and why I was outside the perimeter at that particular moment are the specifics that Isaiah Tran told the room in Caldwell 14 months ago, and I am going to let him tell them, because he tells them better than I would. What I will tell you is that the injury was assessed at the base infirmary and that the assessment was thorough and that I was returned to limited duty within 4 days, which was exactly as soon as the assessment said I could be returned to any duty, and I did not argue with the timeline. I needed to get back. The deployment ended. I came home. My back was permanently changed, not ruined, not debilitating. Exactly. Though there were mornings when the difference between debilitating and manageable felt like a narrow line. Changed. The left side of my lumbar was a recording of that night in ways that no subsequent treatment had been able to entirely revise, and I had made a certain peace with this over the years, a peace of the practical kind. I wore the brace. I kept the ibuprofen. I used the heating pad. I managed, and I did not tell my family, not because I was embarrassed, but because explaining would have required context that I had decided somewhere along the way was mine to keep. Over the next 12 years, I thought about telling them sometimes. There were specific moments when the decision to stay silent felt like a choice and not just a habit. My cousin Anita's wedding in 2012, where someone at the reception table asked about my service, and my uncle answered for me with a summary that reduced 20 deployments worth of work to she does the pastoral side of things, which is good because the rest of us do the hard side. I smiled, I drank my water, I did not correct him. There was the Christmas gathering in 2015 where Diane asked, in front of 6 relatives, whether I ever wished I had done something more with my time in the army. And I said no. And she said, well, you found your lane and you stuck with it, which I think in her mind was a compliment. There was the Veterans Day dinner in 2018 where my father sat at the head of the table and gave his annual acknowledgement of service, going around and naming each veteran present and saying something specific about their contribution. And when he reached me, he said, "Faith kept the spirit of the unit," which was the most he had ever said in that context about my work, and which contained more dignity than anything he had said the night I told him I was going to seminary, and which I received in the spirit in which it was offered. My father died in February of 2020. He was 81 years old. He had been declining for 2 years. First the slight slowing, then the medication, then the hospital, then the specific quiet of a body that has decided it is done with the business of living. I was with him near the end. We were alone in the room for about 40 minutes on the second to last afternoon, and he was not fully conscious. And I sat beside him and held his hand and said the things I had spent 22 years learning to say to people who could no longer say them back to me. I told him I was proud to have been his daughter. I told him I understood that the vocabulary he had was not always equal to what he felt. I told him that I had gone where I was needed, consistently, and that I believed he would have done the same if the path had opened for him the way it opened for me. I do not know how much he heard. It does not matter. The words needed to be said, and I said them, and after he died, I was glad they were out of me and no longer waiting. The funeral was at a church in Decatur. Attendance was substantial. My father had lived in that community for 40 years and had given more of himself to it than any of us had fully mapped. The reception afterward was in the church fellowship hall. Diane gave a toast. She spoke for 12 minutes. I know because I was counting. My method for managing rooms where I need to regulate myself is to track time. The way a runner tracks distance as a way of knowing how much is left to hold. Diane spoke about my father's service and his sacrifice and the discipline with which he had shaped their lives. She spoke about 3 stories from her own family's history with him. She spoke about a fishing trip from when she was 9 years old. She thanked the people who had supported him in his final months. She said at the end that he had raised daughters who understood what it meant to serve. She did not say my name once during those 12 minutes. I sat in the second row and watched the faces. Some people noticed. I could identify them by the slight change in their posture, the almost imperceptible shift that people make when they have become aware of an omission that should not be there. My cousin Anita, who was in the Marine Corps for 9 years and who does not miss things like that, caught my eye from across the room and held it for 2 seconds. I looked away first. After the reception, Anita found me in the parking lot. She said, "Faith." I said, "I know." She said, "You should have been mentioned." I said, "I was in the room." She said, "You know what I mean." I said, "It's fine." She said, "It's not fine, Faith." I said, "I know." She said it again, quieter. "It's not fine." She drove away, and I sat in my old green pickup and did not start the engine for 23 minutes. I retired from the Army in August of 2020. The ceremony was at the base. Colonel Sandra Beecham spoke about what my 22 years had meant. She was specific. She named specific soldiers and specific moments, and she said things that demonstrated that she had actually paid attention to what I had been doing, which is not always the case with retirement speeches. Polly came. She had driven 400 miles in the maroon minivan that was manufactured in 2007, and that breaks down at a frequency that should not be statistically achievable. It broke down 70 miles outside the base, and Polly arrived 40 minutes late with road oil on her left forearm and a gas station ham and cheese sandwich in her jacket pocket, and she sat in the back row, and when it was over, she walked straight to me and said, "Well, I did not miss the good part." And I held on to her for longer than I usually let myself do that kind of thing. My family did not attend. Diane had a prior commitment that she had communicated to me 2 weeks in advance with what I understood to be genuine regret. Anita sent a card with a handwritten note that said she was proud of me and that she was sorry she could not be there. 2 other cousins sent text messages. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I am not constructing a case against the people I love. They were not malicious. They simply did not have sufficient information to understand what the occasion warranted, and I had been the one withholding the information, and that is my responsibility, and I have made my peace with it. But I sat in that ceremony and I felt the empty chairs, and when I drove home that evening, I allowed myself to feel it for the duration of the drive, and then I put it down because that is what you learn to do in 22 years of sitting with other people's pain. You develop a relationship with setting things down. You get better at it. You are never entirely finished. I moved to Caldwell, Georgia, 18 months after I retired. I chose Caldwell because it was neither the place where I had served nor the place where I had grown up, and that double distance suited me in ways I am still understanding. I got a part-time position at a veterans counseling center on the east side of town. I drove my old green pickup. I drank too much coffee and woke too early and went to bed before 9. And on Sunday mornings, I attended a small church 3 blocks from my house where no one expected me to be the chaplain. I was just a woman in a back pew who showed up every week and did not require anything from anyone. It was the most restful arrangement I had found in my adult life. Polly called 3 times a week. She lived 45 minutes away, which I considered a perfect distance, close enough to require no planning and far enough to prevent excessive frequency. She came for dinner every other Thursday, and she brought terrible wine with great enthusiasm, and we ate at the kitchen table and talked about everything and nothing for hours at a time. And those evenings were a kind of medicine that I could not have written a prescription for because it had no pharmaceutical equivalent. It was just 2 people at a table who had known each other for 25 years and who were comfortable enough with each other to be quiet. This was the shape of my life when the city of Caldwell decided to name a wing of the new community center after specialist Raymond Toth. Raymond Toth had been born and raised in Caldwell. He had been killed in action in Afghanistan in 2009. He was 23 years old. He had been a member of the congregation at First Community Church, and his mother still lived in the town. And the city council's decision to honor him was the right decision, made for the right reasons, and executed with the particular care of people who understood they were handling something that mattered. The dedication ceremony was planned for the 14th of March, a Saturday. They wanted a chaplain to speak. Someone gave them my name. I almost said no 3 separate times. The first time was when the initial call came from the organizers, and I said, "Let me think about it," which in my personal vocabulary means I am leaning toward no and need a reason to reconsider. The second time was 2 days later, when I had been thinking about it and had written out a mental list of reasons why someone else would serve the occasion better and found that the list had no items that held up under examination. The third time was the morning I sat down to draft my remarks and found that the drafting felt like an intrusion into something that belonged to Raymond Toth's family and the people who had actually known him, and I almost called and withdrew. And then I thought about what it means to be asked to stand beside a person in their worst moment and to say yes, which is the whole foundation of the work I had done for 22 years, and I finished the draft. Diane called the week before the ceremony. She had heard about it from Anita and said she and Robert would be coming. She said this in the tone she uses when she wants something understood as a gesture of family solidarity, a reaching across the ordinary distance of our lives towards something warmer. I said thank you. She said it would be good to see me doing something. I held the phone for a moment. She said immediately, "I don't mean it like that." I said, "I know." Neither of us spoke for a moment. We agreed to meet for coffee before the ceremony, and we hung up. The coffee was at a diner on the east side of Caldwell with laminated menus and good biscuits and a server who refilled your cup before you needed to ask. Diane looked well. She had cut her hair shorter than I remembered and was wearing a blazer that suited her. Robert was warm and asked questions about my life in Caldwell that demonstrated genuine interest. I told him about the counseling center. Diane said it sounded like good work. I said I thought so too. Robert excused himself to use the restroom, and Diane leaned forward slightly and said, "You always were more the type for this kind of thing, not the combat side, the taking care of side." I looked at her. She said, "That's not a criticism." I said, "I know." She said, "Some people are built for the front and some for the back, and there's nothing wrong with the back." I said, "No, there isn't." And Robert came back and we talked about something else. I drove to the church and sat in my truck for 9 minutes before I went inside. The fellowship hall had been arranged with folding chairs in rows facing a small raised platform at the front. There was a podium with a microphone and flowers on either side, and Raymond Toth's photograph on a stand to the left, his dress uniform perfect, the slight asymmetry to his smile making him look like someone you would have wanted to know. His mother was already seated in the front row. She was a small woman with very still hands, and she was looking at her son's photograph with the particular quality of attention that I have learned to recognize over decades of sitting beside bereaved parents, the way the eyes hold both the person in the photograph and the one who is no longer in the room. Polly was there. Of course she was. She had driven the minivan without incident, which she mentioned twice, and was sitting 3 rows back from the front in a yellow blouse that made her easy to find across any room. She caught my eye and gave me a small wave. I found my seat. The mayor arrived at 11:05 and the ceremony began. The mayor spoke well about Raymond Toth. 8 minutes of specific and genuine appreciation. The veterans group read a poem that was exactly right for the occasion. Raymond Toth's mother stood and said that her son had believed in service the way she had believed in church, not because it was easy, but because it was who he was, and she was grateful to the city for keeping his name in a place where people would pass it every day. When she sat down, the room held a silence that did not need to be filled. I was the last to speak. I walked to the podium. I looked out at 63 people in the chairs, which I counted because I count things. I saw Diane and Robert near the middle, Diane with her hands folded in her lap. I saw Polly in her yellow blouse. I saw Raymond Toth's mother with her tired, kind eyes. I adjusted the microphone. I said good morning. I began. I spoke for approximately 7 minutes. I talked about the weight of absence, the specific gravity of a chair that should not be empty. I said that the point of a name on a building is not to help the dead feel remembered, because the dead have moved beyond the need for our memory. The point is what naming does to us. It keeps in front of us the measure of what a person can choose to be when they decide something matters more than their own safety. I said Raymond Toth had made that decision. I said we were all in his company now. I said a short prayer, direct, without elaborate language, the kind I have always preferred. I was stepping back from the podium when I heard the back door of the fellowship hall open. There is a quality of sound in a room of people listening carefully that is different from ordinary room noise. It has a density to it, a collective held breath, and when the back door came open, that density shifted. I heard several people turn in their chairs. I did not turn immediately. I finished the sentence I was in the middle of, which was roughly 1.5 sentences, and then I stepped to the side of the podium and looked toward the back of the room. A man was standing in the doorway. He was in his early 50s, silver-haired, close-cropped, with a posture that I recognized immediately and did not need to look at twice. He was in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a button-down shirt with the collar open. He had a prosthetic left leg. In his right hand, he was holding a manila folder. He was looking at me and not at anyone else in the room. Through the open door behind him, in the narrow corridor leading from the parking lot, I could see people standing and waiting. The man walked to the center of the room. He did not ask permission to speak, and he did not look at the mayor or the organizers or anyone except me until he stopped halfway between the back wall and the podium. He said, "I am sorry for the interruption." His voice was the kind that fills a room not because it is loud, but because it has learned to carry weight without effort. He said, "My name is Isaiah Tran. I am a retired Sergeant Major, United States Army. I served in Afghanistan in 2006 through 2007, in 2009 through 2010, and in 2012. I have in this folder the names of 22 other veterans. And I have 22 people standing in that hallway right now. No one in the room spoke. Isaiah Tran turned to the doorway and said something I could not hear, and they came in. They came in quietly, the way people enter a room where something serious is happening. Men and women, ranging in age from what appeared to be late 20s to early 60s, some in civilian clothes, some in partial uniform, some wearing a unit patch on a jacket, a service hat, a particular quality of movement that I had spent 22 years learning to recognize, the way a person carries their body when they have spent years knowing exactly where they are in any given space. They did not form a line or a military formation. They came in and spread out along the back wall and the side walls of the room, and they stood because there were not enough chairs for them. When the last person had come through the door and it closed behind them, I counted 22. Isaiah Tran made 23. I was still standing at the side of the podium. My back was hurting, with the specific dull persistence of my lower left lumbar in its worst configuration, the way it gets when I have been standing in one position through a period of high emotion. I put one hand on the edge of the podium. Not for support, exactly, for something solid. Isaiah Tran said, Chaplain Mercer. I said, Sergeant Major. He said, I flew here from Portland this morning. He said, I have been wanting to do this for 6 years. He said, I need your family to hear something. He looked around the room and then his gaze settled on Diane with the specificity of a man who has prepared for this moment and done his research. Diane was sitting very straight. Her hands were in her lap. Her expression was the one she puts on when she does not yet understand a situation but is preparing to respond to it appropriately once she does. Isaiah Tran said, Is someone here a family member of Faith Mercer? Diane said, I am her sister. Isaiah Tran said, Good. He opened the manila folder. He said, I am going to read 22 names from this folder. After each name, the person whose name I read is going to say present. And then I am going to tell you what happened on the night of October the 14th, 2006. The room was completely still. Isaiah Tran read the names. He read them slowly, one at a time, in the manner that a name deserves to be read when the person it belongs to is being asked to account for something. He read each name and paused, and from somewhere along the walls of the room, the voice of that person said present, quietly, in the manner of a soldier answering roll call, not as a performance, but as a simple confirmation. I am here. That person is here. After each name, there was a brief silence, and then the next name came, and the pattern continued. 22 names, 22 voices. I recognized some of the names, several I did not. That is not unusual. A chaplain across 22 years accumulates a volume of encounters that the memory cannot hold in equal resolution. Some you remember in detail, some you remember in shape only. Some you cannot be certain you remember at all until someone names them and then the context arrives behind the name. It does not diminish what passed between you. It is simply the nature of work done at such a volume and across such a span of time. When the last name had been read and the last voice had said present, Isaiah Tran refolded the paper and put it back in the folder. He said, There are 44 more names that belong on this list. Some of those people have died. Some I could not reach. Some are in places in their lives where returning to this is not something they can manage right now. He tapped the folder with one hand. He said, But their words are in here. He said, I have statements. Written statements from 31 of the 44. He said, some of them are 1 sentence long and some of them are 3 pages long, and every single one of them is in this folder. He looked at me. He said, Chaplain? I said, Sergeant Major. He said, Do you remember the night of October the 14th, 2006? I said, I remember it. He said, Will you tell your family what happened that night? I was quiet for a moment. He said, If you will not, I will. I said, Then you tell it. Isaiah Tran told it the way a man tells something that has been inside him for a long time and has not gotten lighter. He said that on the night of October the 14th, 2006, in a village in Kunar province in eastern Afghanistan, a patrol from his unit was ambushed in the early hours of the morning. He said there were multiple casualties. He said 2 soldiers were in positions in the field that could not be reached by their own unit without crossing approximately 200 meters of open ground that a sniper had established clear control over. He said the unit had called for extraction and was waiting, and that in the meantime 2 wounded men were in the field, accessible to their comrades only at the cost of creating additional casualties. He said that at roughly 3:37 in the morning, Faith Mercer, who at that time held the rank of captain and was attached to his unit in a chaplain support capacity, heard the radio traffic. He paused. He said, She walked out of the forward position. He said this without drama, and that absence of drama was the thing that made it land the way it landed, the flatness of it, the matter-of-fact quality of saying she walked out as if it were a thing that any person would do, which it was not, which everyone in that room who had ever served understood immediately it was not. He said, She did not carry a weapon. He paused again. He said, Chaplains do not carry weapons. He said it as a weight and not as a fact. He said, She had a trauma kit on her back, and she walked out into the open ground, and she kept walking. He said there was radio communication throughout. He said he had heard her voice on the radio the entire time she was out there. He said she was saying things. He stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment. Isaiah Tran is not a man who shows emotion the way most people show it. What crossed his face in that moment was not a performance of grief or gravity. It was simply those things, without the framing, without the presentation. He said, the first soldier she reached was Corporal Andrew Lynn. He was 20 years old and he had been wounded by the blast that had initiated the ambush. He said, I need to tell you that Andrew Lynn is not here today. He died in 2012. Not in the field. He died at home in Colorado from complications of the injuries he sustained that night. He said, but Andrew Lynn called his mother from the base 3 days after October the 14th. He said, Andrew told his mother that a chaplain had walked to him in the dark. He said, Andrew told his mother that when he heard her voice, he stopped being afraid. Not that he stopped being in pain, that he stopped being afraid. He said, you understand the difference. He did not say it as a question. The room did not move. He said, the second soldier was Private First Class Marcus Webb. He was 19 years old. He said, Marcus is in this room today. He looked toward the right wall. A man standing there moved forward slightly, not stepping out but acknowledging. He was 28 years old now, with a stillness about him that was not the stillness of passivity. He had learned to be very quiet inside himself. Isaiah Tran said, Marcus. The man said, yes. Isaiah Tran said, will you tell them what you told me? Marcus Webb was quiet for a moment. He was looking at me. He said, she found me first. He said it simply and he sat down, and no one in the room needed it translated. Isaiah Tran said, Faith Mercer pulled Marcus Webb across 60 meters of open ground while the sniper was still active. He said, the IED that had wounded both soldiers detonated a second device on her return, approximately 40 meters to her left. He said, the blast threw her approximately 12 feet, and she landed hard and she sustained injuries to her lower left lumbar that she has been managing for 19 years. He stopped. He said it again, quietly. 19 years. He said, she got up. He said, she got Marcus to cover. He said, she went back for Andrew Lynn. He said, she did not stop. He said, her commanding officer filed an after-action report the following morning recommending her for a formal commendation. He opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper and held it up. He said, the commendation was approved. He said, it was never formally presented. He looked at the paper for a moment, and then he set it face down on the nearest empty chair. He said, I have spent 6 years trying to understand why, and I have not found a satisfactory answer. He said, I am not here to give her a medal today. He said, I am here because 6 months ago, I heard from a friend of a friend that Faith Mercer's family believed she had never really served. He let that sentence sit in the room without adding anything to it for several seconds. He said, I went to a storage unit in Portland, and I pulled out this folder. He held it up. He said, and I started making calls. I was holding the edge of the podium. My back was hurting considerably. I had not moved. I looked at Diane. Diane was not looking at Isaiah Tran. She was looking at me. Her hands were in her lap, and they were no longer composed. They were still, but a different kind of still. The kind that comes from effort rather than ease. Her face was doing something I had not seen it do before, which was the revision in real time of a map she had been navigating for 47 years. It is not a comfortable thing to watch in someone you love. It is not a comfortable thing to see in yourself when it happens, either. I knew the look. I had seen versions of it across decades in that small office that smelled of industrial cleaning products and institutional carpet. I had sat across from many people while they revised their maps. I had never expected to be the landscape being revised. Isaiah Tran said, I have one more thing. He said, The 23 of us who are in this room today represent people who found Chaplain Mercer during the worst periods of our lives. He said, some of us she talked to. Some of us she walked to. Some of us she carried. He said, not one of us knew the others were coming. He said, I made 22 phone calls and 22 people drove or flew or took the train to be in this room on a Saturday morning because I asked them to. He said, I need to be honest with you. When I started making those calls, I thought maybe 8 of us would show up. He said, and then a 23rd called me 4 days ago. A man whose name I did not have on my original list. He had heard about it from someone who heard it from someone else. He drove 11 hours from outside Knoxville. He looked toward the left wall where a man in his mid-30s was standing with his arms at his sides. He said, that is what a chaplain does. Not just this chaplain. A chaplain carries something into the field that is not a weapon, he said, and sometimes that thing is heavier than anything else in the field. He turned to the people standing along the walls. He looked at all of them. He said, on your feet. They were already standing, but they stood differently. The shift that a soldier makes when the situation calls for a particular quality of attention. Isaiah Tran turned back to face the room and he said, we are standing behind the chaplain. It was the plainest sentence he had spoken in the entire time he had been talking, and it was the sentence that did the most work. It landed in the room the way a plain thing does when it is exactly the right thing, when the simplicity is the whole point, when nothing elaborate is needed because the thing being said is sufficient on its own. I looked at Polly. She was not crying, which surprised me because Polly cries at everything. She was looking at me with a face that said something I did not need to hear out loud. She gave a small nod. I nodded back. I looked at Raymond Toth's mother. She was watching me with her still hands and her tired, kind eyes and the expression of someone who recognized without surprise a thing she had always known to be true. That the people who keep others alive are not always the ones with the most visible armor. I looked at Diane. Diane was looking down at her hands. Robert had his hand on her arm. After a moment, she looked up. Not at Isaiah Tran. At me. The ceremony found its resolution the way these things do, with grace and without force. The mayor saying a few well-chosen words about the unexpected nature of what had happened, and then returning the room to the purpose that had brought everyone there in the first place. We prayed together. We went outside briefly to look at the name on the wall of the wing. Raymond Toth's mother put her hand on the letters of his name and held it there for a long moment, and nobody said anything. Back inside, the room shifted from ceremony to the softer movement of people in the aftermath of something significant. Several of the 23 came to speak with me. A woman named Carla, who had served in Iraq and who had spent 6 sessions in my office at Fort Bragg in 2015 working through the end of her first marriage, said she had driven from Birmingham and was glad she did. A man who gave only his first name, Michael, said he had been in my care during my second Afghanistan deployment and that I had helped him write a letter to his father that he had never been able to write alone and that his father had died the following year and that the letter had been in his father's hands at the viewing and that he had thought about that letter and about me every single November since. And he shook my hand and walked out before I had to respond, which I think he intended. Isaiah Tran shook my hand last. He held it longer than a handshake requires. He said, I should have done this sooner. I said, you did it exactly when it needed doing. He said, that's generous. I said, it's accurate. He said he was flying back to Portland that evening. I said, safe travels, Sergeant Major. He said, you too, Chaplain. He gave me a single nod and walked out with his manila folder under his arm. Marcus Webb was standing near the door when I finally made it to that part of the room. He was 28 years old and had the eyes of someone who has seen a specific thing and integrated it into who they are rather than tried to set it somewhere outside themselves. I said, thank you for making the drive. He said, I drove 11 hours. I said, I know. He said, I would have driven more. I did not have the right words for that, which is unusual for me, so I said nothing. And he seemed to understand that the nothing was the correct response, because he nodded once, and we stood in the comfortable silence of two people who had once been in the same dark place and had both come out the other side. He shook my hand and left. Polly found me at the coffee table along the side wall. She handed me a cup without being asked, because she has known me for 25 years and she knows I will forget to get coffee for myself when I am overwhelmed. I drank it. I said, "You knew he was coming." She said, "I may have." I said, "How long?" She said, 3 weeks. He called looking for your family's contact information. I said, "You could have warned me." She said, "I thought about it." I said, "And?" She said, "I thought you deserved the full version." I said, "I could have been better prepared." She said, "Faith." She tilted her head to the side. She said, "You were prepared exactly fine." She picked up her own coffee cup. She said, "He was the one who needed to be prepared." I drank more coffee. Diane found me near the door as the room was thinning. She said, "Faith." I said, "Diane." She said, "I didn't know." I looked at her. I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I thought about it, not performing the thinking, actually thinking. I said, "I was waiting to be asked." She was quiet. I said, "And I'm not sure I knew how to answer even if someone had asked." She said, "I should have asked." I said, "Yes." I said it without accusation because there was no accusation in me. It was simply true. She should have asked. I should have told. Both of those things were true, and neither of them canceled the other out, and the space between them was where the 47 years of partial knowledge had lived, and now we were standing in that space, and it was uncomfortable, and it was necessary, and it was exactly where we needed to be. Diane said, "I'm sorry, not just for today." She looked at me steadily. I said, "I know. I meant it." I said it not to close the conversation, but because it was true. I did know. I had always known, in the fundamental sense, that Diane loved me in the way she knew how to love, which was organized and purposeful and expressed through the maintenance of contact and the performance of family solidarity, and that the portrait she had of me was the best portrait she could build with the materials she had. I could not hold her responsible for the materials she had not been given. Robert said something I did not hear, and Diane nodded and they said goodbye, and I watched them walk to the parking lot. I stood for a moment in front of Raymond Toth's photograph before I left. The slight asymmetry to his smile, the perfectly pressed uniform, the eyes of a 23-year-old who had not yet lived long enough to be afraid of what he was becoming. I stood there for a while with no particular purpose except to be in front of it, to let the fact of him be present in the space without me trying to do anything with it. Outside, through the windows, I could see people moving toward their cars. The day was doing the ordinary things a March day does in Georgia. Clouds moving across a pale sky, the light inconsistent, warm and then not warm. An ordinary day that had contained something extraordinary inside it, and now was returning to its ordinary character. And I was going to drive home in my old green pickup, and that was the right and appropriate next thing. I sat in the truck for 3 minutes before I started the engine. Then I drove home. I went into the house and I changed out of my good clothes into something comfortable, and I got the heating pad from the closet and I positioned it behind my lower left lumbar on the couch, and I ate the leftover soup that Polly had brought 2 Thursdays ago, and that I had been rationing with more discipline than I expected. The house was quiet in the way that a house is quiet after something large has happened inside it and the event itself has ended, but the weight of it is still settling into the walls and the floors and the furniture. I sat with the quiet. I was not sad, exactly. I was not triumphant. I was the specific feeling of a weight that you have been carrying so long you forgot it was there, and you have set it down, and you are slightly bewildered by the absence of it, and your body does not quite know yet how to move without it. Polly called at 8:47. I know because I looked at the clock when my phone rang. She said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm on the couch with the heating pad." She said, "Obviously, but how are you doing?" I said, "I'm all right." She said, "I believe you, which is different from the usual." I said, "Yes." She said, "You know what I kept thinking about all day?" I said, "What?" She said, "The folder?" She said, 6 years, Faith. He kept that folder for 6 years in a storage unit in Portland. I said, "Yes." She said, "He drove to that storage unit and pulled it out and started making calls." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's not duty. That is just love organized like a military operation." I said, "Don't make me cry." She said, "Is that actually possible at this point?" I said, "Always." She said, "I believe that too." We talked for an hour and 18 minutes about nothing significant. The minivan, a show she had been watching, whether I needed different trees in the backyard, whether the coffee at the diner was better than my own coffee, which it objectively is. Eventually she said goodnight and I said goodnight and I turned off the lamp. I did not sleep immediately. I lay in the dark and I thought about Marcus Webb saying she found me first. I have been in that phrase many times since, in the dark, in the way that particular arrangements of words occupy the mind when they contain more than their surfaces. Finding someone is not a geographic action when you are 19 years old and wounded in a field. Being found is not about the coordinates being located. It is about the arrival of someone who was not there and then is. The interval between the not there and the is, the crossing of that interval, the decision to cross it, and then the crossing itself, that is the thing. That is the whole shape of the thing. And it is what I walked out of the forward position to do on the night of October the 14th, 2006. And it is what I did on 147 other occasions over 22 years in small offices and base hallways and vehicle seats and the ground outside, forward positions in 2 countries. And it is the thing that cannot be seen from the outside when the person doing it is not holding a weapon. And it is the thing that was seen clearly and completely by the 23 people who stood along the walls of a fellowship hall in Caldwell, Georgia on the 14th of March. I thought about Diane saying I didn't know. I have thought about it many times since. I do not think it as an accusation. I think it as a fact. And as a fact, it carries in it my own portion of the responsibility, because the knowing and the not knowing exist in both directions. She did not know what my work was. I did not tell her what my work was. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the gap between them is not anyone's fault specifically, but it belongs to both of us, and both of us are responsible for what we do with it now. We have had 4 more coffees since the ceremony. Each one is slightly less careful than the one before, which is the right direction for 2 people who have been careful with each other across too many years. She asks questions now. Not the questions she used to ask, the ones that came from the portrait she had built of me, but actual questions, the kind that begin from not knowing and want to know. I answer some of them, not all. Some of what happened in Kunar province and Fort Bragg and the small office in Afghanistan belongs to the people it happened to, and I will not make it into a story for my own family's edification, but I answer enough, more than I ever answered before. And she listens in the way that a person listens when they are genuinely revising something, without interruption, without trying to place what they are hearing into a category they already have. Just listening and letting it change the portrait and sitting with the discomfort of the change. At one coffee, she said, "Were you afraid?" I said, "Always." She said, "But you went anyway." I said, "That's the job." She said, "It's more than the job." She said it quietly, like a concession she had been working toward for a long time and had finally arrived at. I said, "Yes." She stirred her coffee. She said, "I think I didn't understand what the job was." I said, "I think I could have helped you understand it." She said, "We're both doing the thing." I said, "What thing?" She said, "Both taking the blame for the gap." I said, "Yes." She said, "Maybe no one is to blame." I said, "I think that's probably right." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, I still wish I had known you better. I said, I feel that way about myself too. She said, that's a strange thing to say. I said, I know. She said, but I think I understand what you mean. Isaiah Tran sent me copies of the after action report and the commendation from 2006. They arrived in a large envelope from Portland with a handwritten note that said simply, these belong with you. I put them in a drawer in my desk. Not the same drawer as James Weather's letter, but they are in the same desk, and that seems right. A person's record of their own life does not need to be framed and hung on a wall. It needs to exist, and be accessible, and be real, and it is. Polly came for dinner the Thursday after the ceremony, and she brought the worst bottle of wine she has ever produced, which takes genuine effort at this point given her track record. And we ate at the kitchen table, and she told me about what the minivan had done on the highway that afternoon, a story that involved a sound she described as like a goat learning to sing. And I laughed for the first time in several weeks in the specific way that arrives without warning and requires no preparation, the laugh that comes out of relief rather than humor. She said, there it is. I said, there what is? She said, you. I said, I'm always here. She said, you know what I mean. I said, yes. She poured more of the terrible wine. She said, I want to say something and I need you to just let me say it. I said, all right. She said, I am proud of you. I said, for today. She said, for all of it. For 22 years of going to where it was hard and doing the thing that nobody sees and not requiring anyone to see it. She said, that is a specific kind of courage, and I don't think it's named often enough, and I want to name it right now at this table with this terrible wine to your face. I said, Polly. She said, I know, but let me finish. She said, you found people. That's what you did for 22 years. You found people who were lost, and you said, I'm here, and you meant it. She said, not everyone can do that. I said, most people can. She said, no, Faith. She said, most people can say, I'm here. Not everyone can walk 200 meters across an active field to say it. She raised her terrible whine. She said, to the ones who walk. I raised mine. I said, to the ones who walk. Sometime in the weeks after the ceremony, I went back to the community center. I went on a Tuesday afternoon when it would be less busy, and I stood in the lobby in front of the entrance to the Raymond Toth wing. His photograph was there, behind a small plaque with his name and his dates, and the slight asymmetry to his smile was the same in this version as it had been in the one at the ceremony, as if the photograph were keeping faith with who he was. The center was busy with ordinary life, a group of children moving in a cluster toward the gym, a woman with a stroller consulting her phone, an older man with a veteran's service cap navigating the corridor with patience. None of them stopped at the plaque. This is the right way of things. A name on a wall does not demand your attention at every moment. It is there to be part of the background of the place where ordinary people do ordinary things, to be in the room while life is happening, to mean something without requiring performance. I thought about what it means to be the kind of person who does their work in the dark. Not in the literal dark, not always, though sometimes literally. In the dark, in the sense of the unilluminated, the unobserved, the work that happens without an audience and without documentation and without the record being kept anywhere except in the bodies and the minds of the people who needed it to happen. I had spent 22 years being that kind of person. I had made my peace with it more than once. And then Isaiah Tran had walked through a back door with 22 people behind him and a manila folder in his hand, and he had turned the light on, not because the work required it, not because the work meant less without it, but because my family had been living with a false portrait of me for 47 years, and he had decided that enough was enough. The truth of what a person does in service does not depend on whether the people who love them can see it. The truth exists in the places where it happened. In the dark and the cold and the open ground. In the small offices that smell of institutional carpet. In the specific words you say to someone who is losing the ability to stay. In the voice on the radio at 3:37 in the morning saying, I'm here, I've got you, you're going home. That truth is whole, whether it is witnessed or not. The 23 people who stood in that fellowship hall did not create it. They named it. And the naming, it turns out, had its own worth. Not for me, not entirely, but for the people who had been living with the wrong version for too long and who deserved the right one. I drove home from the community center in the old green pickup. The passenger side mirror is still cracked. I have been meaning to replace it for 2 years. I will probably replace it eventually, and it does not matter if I don't, because I know what I need to see, and I have always known how to check my blind spots. I drove home and I made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table and I wrote a letter to Marcus Webb. Not a long letter, 3 paragraphs. I thanked him for coming. I told him that I had heard many versions of the words "I'm here" over the course of my life, and that his 4 words, "She found me first," were the most complete thing anyone had ever said about the work I had spent 22 years doing. I told him that the reason I had gone to find him that night was not courage and not duty. It was the same reason I went every other time I went, because someone was out there and they needed a voice, and I was the one who could walk. I told him that the fact of his being in that room on the 14th of March had changed something for me that I had not known needed changing. I put the letter in an envelope and sent it to the return address he had given me when he shook my hand. He wrote back 2 weeks later. It was a short letter. He said he was doing well. He said he had been in school for 3 years studying social work. He said he spent a lot of time sitting with people who needed someone to sit with them and that he was good at it. He said he had learned to be good at it from the specific memory of what it felt like to be the person who needed sitting with. He said, "I think the reason you found me is that you knew what I needed before I could name it." He said, "I try to do that now." He said, "I learned it from you, whether you know it or not." I put his letter in the drawer with Isaiah Tran's copies and James Weather's letter from 16 years ago. I sat at my desk for a while. I was not doing anything in particular, just sitting, letting the letters be in the drawer and the drawer be in the desk and the desk be in the room and the room be in the house in Caldwell, where I have been making a quiet and ordinary life since retiring from a work that was not quiet, ordinary, but that I would do again without hesitation, would do the same way, would choose the same door, would walk out into the same open ground, because the thing I know, and that I knew even when no one else knew it, is that the bravest decision you make in a field is not which weapon to carry. It is the decision to go when going is the hardest available choice. It is the 200 meters of open ground at 3:37 in the morning. It is the voice on the radio saying, "I'm here." It is the hand you extend across the distance when you have nothing in it but yourself. And that has always been enough. And it will always be enough. And the 23 people who flew and drove and rode 11 hours to stand in a fellowship hall and say present are the living proof of a truth that did not need their testimony to be true, but that is better in this specific world for having been said aloud in front of the people who needed to hear it. You do not need a weapon to walk into the fire. You need the willingness to go. The bravest thing you will ever carry into danger is yourself, offered without condition, in the dark, to someone who does not yet know you are coming. That is the whole of it. That was always the whole of it.